Good morning to you all. I would like really to thank Minister Hamed Abto for organizing this event together with my good friend, Director General Lee Young of UNIDO, and our guest of honor today, Minister Hamed Chide, that is presiding the session, for this opportunity. I would like to greet you all, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Just about 2 days ago, I was in London for a Financial Times conference on Africa, participating in discussions about industrialization. And the main topic there was, can Africa make things? Can we? Well, the first clarification we had to make to the audience is that Africa exports about $500 billion worth of manufactured goods as of now. So this is not the perception that people normally have. And if we are going to talk about industrialization as a latecomer, it's just because we want to be in an environment and a context where people understand that this industrialization, measured by the amount of manufacturing value addition in our economy, is not enough and is lower than other parts of the world. That's why we consider ourselves latecomers. It's not because we are not there at all. It's because we are not there enough. That's a big difference. So what is the latecomer's advantage? Normally, the latecomer's advantage is to learn from others' mistakes and to take into account an environment that, of course, is dynamic and changes all the time. We are not going to do industrialization like Manchester did 2 centuries ago. So what is it that we can do today, given that the odds are not in our favor? Trade regimes have never been as complex as they are today. The number of agreements is astounding. Intellectual property has been regulated in such a way that most of what we call knowledge economy is value that has been locked in intellectual property regimes that Africa has no access. We have a situation where logistics have become so complex that most of the operations are managed with computerized, sophisticated systems. We are struggling to have ports. We have a situation where the global value chains have become so sophisticated that almost no product is done from A to Z in the same place. You have inputs from different parts of the chain. And even when you do most of the product in one place, part of the chain is not about the production of the physical object or the commodity, but rather the marketing, the branding, and all these different elements we in Africa don't dominate as much. And last but not least, we are late. So niches have been occupied. Most of what we could aim to do somehow is already being done in some part of the world. So how are we going to make it? How are we going to be able to overcome all these constraints? Well, people forget that for almost every one of these constraints, we also have an opportunity. And this is not rhetorical. Let us just go through some of the most incredible opportunities we have for industrialization to accelerate in the continent. I would put as number one our market. We have a huge market. We are 1 billion people. We are going to be 2 billion by 2050. We have one of the fastest growing middle classes in the world. So if we tap into our internal market, obviously we can accelerate a lot of products that are consumed by the market, and chief of them are the agro-processed products. Because we spend about $30 billion a year importing processed food. And there is no reason we cannot process it ourselves. We import yogurt. We import pasta. Is it something that is rocket science that we cannot do? So we have to overcome one of the major difficulties, which is trying to insert ourselves in the global chain by making it our chain, because it's our market. And we are capable of doing this if we do the right things. Second advantage, most of the discussion these days is about climate change and a lot of concern about emissions. Well, Africa contributes very little for the emissions. So some people defend that, why don't we just, do like others? They have polluted the world, we didn't. So we should not listen to them and just do the same thing. Well, we could, and it will be morally justified. But is it in our interest? Or can we leapfrog and do a green industrialization? Because that will position Africa ahead of the curve. While others will be busy retrofitting, we will be capable of actually going straight into where they aim to be. And we can do this for one simple reason. We have the largest renewable energy potential in the world. Just take Hydro, that is now being the subject of very high interest here in Ethiopia with the Renaissance Dam. Take Hydro. We only consume about 5% of the potential that we can generate from hydro-generated energy. Geothermal, solar, wind, we have all these things, more than any other part of the world. And we have it at a time where the costs for production of renewable energy match the costs of fossil fuel. So why should we go to fossil fuel if we can actually, with the same investment and costs, produce renewable and green our industrialization? Another potential that we have, people forget very often that Africa, because of its youthness, is going to have the larger labor force in the world by 2040. Some say 2035, depending on the projections. That will be larger than India and China. Whether people like it or not, other parts of the world are aging. It's a very difficult discussion for other parts of the world to have. Who wants to say, but it's the truth, that there are 61,000 people as of this year over 100 years old in Japan, and that 65 plus people count already for 25% of their population, the same proportion in Europe. But what is more astounding is that by 2050, when we will be, at the height of our demographic curve, Europe, Japan, and other parts of the world are going to be so aged that just in Europe and Japan, 3/4 of the population is going to be over 65, if the projections are right. So we are going to be very important, because no society will be able to survive just with robots and automation. For one simple reason, robots don't pay Social Security. So it will be necessary for those who contribute to Social Security to be matching the ones that are going to benefit from it. So this has to be a compact. So that's our third possibility. So industrialization in Africa is really something that is no joke. It's going to happen. And if people have doubts, we had $600 billion of GDP at the beginning of this century. By last year, we had 1.3 trillion of GDP. If you take into account the fact that we have an underestimation of GDP in Africa, because it's not mentioned, because it's a very technical discussion, but in order for you to have a GDP number, you can get it from two sources. Either you have very good national accounts, or you have projections. Guess what is done in most of Africa? Good national accounts or projections? Well, I can tell you, only 12 countries match the methodological requirements for good national accounts in Africa, which is, amongst other things, to have a base year that is no longer than 5 for you to be able to compare things that make sense. When countries do a rebasing exercise like Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, Ghana did recently, you discover all of a sudden that their economies is much bigger than they thought. Well, guess, the remaining countries that have not done this are underestimating combinedly their GDP by 20%. So 1.3 trillion is not even the real figure. It's much higher, which means that this is historically one of the fastest movements that have been observed in terms of growth, comparable with China 30 years ago. So make no mistake, the fundamentals of Africa, its megatrends, are in favor of a big transformation. Now, this big transformation is better understood when you look at the news, and most of the news these days is about economies in the world not doing so well, including Africa, but one country being a rising star. And that country is India. Well, it's a very good country for us as a continent to compare because they have slightly more people than Africa. So let's look into this comparison. Who has the bigger GDP? India, that is one country, or this conglomerate of 54 very complex, diversified, and difficult to manage number? We have a better number. GDP per capita, obviously, ours is bigger. Proportion of Africa in world trade is bigger than India. Investment attractiveness and flows, Africa beats India. What about the transactions between Africa and other parts of the world? Very interesting. Who is the continent that invests the most in India? You think it's America? You think it's Asia? No, it's Africa. That is something that people don't know. It's because of the role of Mauritius. So the realities are not always what we think. And unfortunately, these realities are always not in favor of Africa. So how do we correct these perceptions is important for our image, but is more important for us to change our mentality. That's why when we discuss any aspect of industrialization in Africa, we have forced ourselves to change our mindset. Look at our leaders. They have been approving a lot of documents about agricultural transformation. Is agricultural reality in Africa really transforming? With a few exceptions, not fast enough. We have the lowest productivity in the world. The lowest. We keep talking all the time about we have 60% of unused arable land in the world. Great. The problem is that the one we use is the worst in terms of productivity. So forget about the 60%. This 40% could have transformed our lives if it was properly used with the levels of productivity that others have. How can you imagine that countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, that didn't produce cocoa, come into the market that has been dominated by Africa for so long, with just two countries, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, being more than 50% of the world production, and they get into levels of productivity and value addition that we don't even dream. What is wrong? Why can they do it in such fast period and we are still struggling? Because they have not married in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and many other African countries, the discussion of industrialization with the discussion on agriculture. These are not two separate discussions. This is the same discussion, because agro-processing and value addition is one of our entry points into real transformation of our economic structure. It is happening here in Ethiopia. We are very happy with it. We have just concluded a study about small, medium-scale enterprises that proves the role of the agro sector in this. We have been at the Economic Commission for Africa studying so much the various lessons that have to be learned from Southeast Asia and imported into Africa. And each time, despite the progress that has been happening in many fronts, we are confronted with this dilemma. Economic structural transformation is not just about diversification, which is a lot of people try to sell to us. But you can diversify from coffee to flowers. It's not about that. It's much more. It's about really making sure that in each and every layer of sophistication, we match with knowledge, we match with innovation, and we match with our understanding of the chains. But more important than all, we match with our determination. Thank you.